and welcome once again to the Brett Chat Sports or BCS podcast. This time I'm going to be correcting a wrong from last year. In this podcast's fourth ever episode, I spoke to a lady called Jennifer Anley and we had a really nice chat. When I then went to edit the episode together though, I discovered that there was some really significant sound sync issues in our chat. I still persisted in editing that episode and putting it out though, because Jennifer had a really good story and she also made some important points about what it's like to be a female spectator at sports venues. The fact that I had to edit around those sound sync issues though meant that you, the viewers and listeners, missed out on some really good details and some really important points that she had to make, particularly towards the end when she was talking about what it's like to be a woman at sports venues. I've since figured out what those issues were though, and I've re-edited the episode together to give you, the viewers and listeners, a much better and fuller picture of what Jennifer had to say. And so without further ado, I give you Jennifer Anley. So, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Yours is a very interesting story, I think, as we're about to find out. So, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and chat with me.
Oh, well, thank you. Not a problem. I'm excited.
Yeah, so I'll start as I start every episode. What are your sporting allegiances? What teams do you support?
Well, I have quite a laundry list. My baseball team is the St. Louis Cardinals and the St. Louis Blues. I also support I was about to say Oakland Raiders, the Las Vegas Raiders, the LSU Tigers, and then closer to home, Tottenham are my Premier League team, and Dundee are my hometown team. And in Germany, I'm a Hertha Berlin fan as well, so I'm a bit all over the place.
Okay, that's a lot of teams to be supporting. I think we should get into it. Like, the reason that you support the St. Louis Cardinals and the St. Louis Blues is that you used to live in St. Louis, and clearly, for anyone watching or listening to this, you are not originally from there. So, what took you to St. Louis then?
It was really funny actually. My dad came home one January day from work. I was in my bedroom doing math homework. I was 13 at the time. He just came into my bedroom and he said, Jennifer, how would you feel if we moved to the States in May? And I went, yeah, okay. And he went, okay. And he just walked out the room. And that was it. And we did. And I remember, I grew up in Cardinals, which is quite a small town, and it felt quite surreal, this thing that we were just going to do. I'd never known anybody that had done anything like that before. And I don't think anybody at school believed me when I told them. They were like, yeah, okay. And then we did. We just packed up. Movers came one day and we got on a plane and moved to the States. And the place that we moved to was St. Louis, which no one has ever heard of. Well, baseball people have heard of it. But yeah, everybody's like, St. Louis, oh yeah, where's that? For those of you who don't know, it is, if you imagine the map of the States, it's right in the middle and then sort of halfway between Chicago and New Orleans. So it's smack bang right in the middle. And we moved, and we moved in May. So the first thing that you do when you get to St. Louis and it's May is you go see the Cardinals. And we did. And that's sort of the start of the Cardinals, yeah. That's how it worked. And that's what happened. We ended up in St. Louis.
Yeah, and I've been fortunate enough to visit St. Louis a couple of times, and it's I admittedly have only been there as a tourist, and it was for a very limited amount of time, but it struck me as a very nice city. Like, what was the experience like for you of living there and growing up there? Like, how did you find it?
It was great, and you're right. That's the thing with St. Louis is, especially coming from a small town in Scotland, it is massive, but it never sort of felt overwhelmingly big. It wasn't like moving to New York or even somewhere like Chicago. A lot of people describe it as a sort of a very big small town, and that's kind of how it felt. Everybody was really funny. You know, I think it quite helped that I had a funny accent, because people were like, "Oh, where are you from?" And you know, Americans tend to be quite friendly anyway, so it made it easier for me, I think, to move in. You know, I remember the first day, they took me on a tour instead of letting me go to first class. So I went to my first class sort of half an hour late, because they'd walked me around the building for some reason. And I walked in and kind of sat down, and the teacher asked me a question, and I answered her, and you could just see everybody go, "Whoa, oh, where are you from?" You know? And then everybody just immediately came over and started asking me questions and talking to me, and it made making friends easier, I think, because I was sort of a bit different. And you know, maybe if you go to, I don't know, a bigger city or somewhere more, you know, well-known people, it maybe wouldn't have fazed anybody, but it was quite, you know, everybody I went to school with thought it was quite different, and they, you know, it was new for them. So it probably helped me make friends and settle in. And yes, we lived there for 12 years. St. Louis, yeah, went to high school. It is exactly like it is in the TV shows. It is exactly like moving into Saved by the Bell. You know, every school has a stadium, and we had like a whole baseball diamond, and you get your own locker everywhere, and it really is like the movies. It was awesome. It was really good. It was
so if you were there for 12 years, you were there into adulthood as well. So I mean, how do you find that as a, you know, being a child and then being an adult? Like, what was that like for you in terms of the experience?
It was great. I can't sort of. I think I was lucky. I was lucky to sort of, I think, experience the States as a teenager, and because you do get to, you know, you go prom and you go Friday night baseball games, and you know, Friday night lights in the fall, and you got homecoming, and you know, I went to uni and joined a sorority and dated a baseball player. You know, like you do all of these things that people do in the movies. You know, and I think if you have moved to the States as an adult, you don't get those experiences. But because I got to move as a teenager and to, you know, uni and all that, I kind of got to do all those things and experience them all. And so I think I was really lucky, because obviously my parents didn't get that. So yeah, it's really good.
So I mean, so as someone who is originally from Scotland, then, like, what was it about baseball? What was it about ice hockey that got you into those sports when you went to St. Louis? What was, what drew you to them?
I think baseball in St. Louis is very special, and I imagine that it's different if you're in a New York or a Chicago or an LA, where you have lots of things going on all the time. And don't get me wrong, St. Louis is not boring, but in the summer, the Cardinals, you know, there's not any that is the main thing that everybody's focused around. And because there's so many, it's become the soundtrack to your summer. So anytime you go into a bar or a restaurant, you go out for lunch, there's probably a TV in the background with the game on, and the sound's on but low. So you can hear like the ball hitting the bat, you can hear the sort of sounds of the crowd, you know, Dan McLaughlin, just become the background of your summer. And everybody goes to baseball in St. Louis. Everybody does it. Even if you're not a huge sports fan, you would still go. It's a great day out. You go sit in the sun. You know, you pay $10 for a Bud Light. It's great. But even before you're 21, we used to go with our friends. You know, there's always cheap tickets about. You know, they do promotions. Like, it's not sort of, it's very accessible, and it's a nice day out, and everybody kind of, it really is just a part of life. It's a part of summer. Like, summer without baseball is quite odd to me. It just really is a part of everyday life in St. Louis. You can't escape it, really, even if you wanted to.
So, and you mentioned that you're a fan of what are now the Las Vegas Raiders. When you were in St. Louis, the Rams would have been in St. Louis as well. So what was it that meant that you became a Raiders fan rather than being a Rams fan then?
So we were Raiders fans before we moved to St. Louis. So my dad was a fan of the John Madden Raiders, and the sort of swashbuckling, no rules, bad boy Raiders. And then through the 80s, you've got sort of the NWA and the Las Vegas, the Los Angeles Raiders, and that sort of culture. And so my dad had always been a Raiders fan. I'm old enough to where there are pictures of me as a little girl with like Los Angeles Raiders stuff on, and my dad got the Cheerios out and would like show me all the plays and the X's and O's, and yeah, so it was something that I just had always grown up watching and always sort of was a part of my life. And it was interesting moving to St. Louis because we were the team other than the Rams that were closest to us was the Chiefs, which we don't like very much, but it meant that the Raiders always had a divisional game that was driving distance. So we'd try and go to Kansas City as often as we could, go to Arrowhead, and the Bay Area is a lot closer to St. Louis than it is to Carnoustie. So, and my dad's birthday is October, mine is November, so we try and go for one of our birthdays, depending on how the schedule falls and stuff. We'd go out to Oakland, and I just love the Bay Area. If it wasn't insanely expensive, I'd love to live there. Yeah, so moving to St. Louis allowed us to have sort of more experiences with the Raiders as well, even though they weren't exactly in our back door. And yeah, we go to Rams games. Rams games were fun. It's sort of football without the pressure. You go, you hope to win, but you're not upset if they lose.
As someone who has lived in St. Louis and so knew what the Rams' place was in that city, like what was your reaction to the Rams going back to LA then? What do you think that will have done to the city? Because I've been to St. Louis after the Rams moved back to LA, and I certainly know what I thought. But as someone who lived there, what did you think?
The Rams in St. Louis it's odd, I think, as a British sports fan, that teams move around. The whole thing's weird, really, to me. Like Tottenham are never going to leave North London, but so the whole concept I think is odd. And what's odd about it is, like the Raiders kind of moved within sort of a driving distance radius. So wherever, if you're in LA or you're in the Bay Area or even in Vegas, you can probably still go watch the Raiders. Like that doesn't really affect, But the Rams moved from LA to St. Louis.
I would have to disagree with you slightly there, given that the Oakland Athletics are going to be moving to Las Vegas. I personally don't think 400 miles is driving distance. And I know that there's a lot of fellow A's fans who are from the Bay Area who are not happy, particularly given how far the move is. But I digress. Please do excuse me for interrupting you.
No, not at all, and that's perfectly valid. And I think it is different for the NFL than it is for baseball because there's 80 odd home games. So there's 8 home games in the NFL. So you might make that distance 2 times, 4 times, 8 times. You're probably not going to drive it 86 times, and you're not going to. So I think, yes, I think that's perfectly valid. But I think it's slightly different for the sports because of the frequency of when they play and sort of how you consume baseball when you live in a baseball city is different. So, like for example, in St. Louis, you can buy this like monthly pass, it's like $40. It just gives you access to the stadium. So if you've got something like that, you might just go watch the Cardinals on a lunch break. You might just pop in after work and watch the last few innings. Whereas like with an NFL game, because there's less of them, I think you consume it differently. So I think the move is very different, and I feel different about it because I think I would support the A's if I didn't live in St. Louis. I have a soft spot for them, and I'm very annoyed they're in Vegas. But I think it's just because you consume them differently as a fan.
Okay, so that's fair enough.
But sorry, back to your original question. The Rams of St. Louis is a weird one. Because if you live in St. Louis, and if you think sort of the NFL geographically, a lot of people are Cowboys fans, a lot of people are Green Bay fans, not so much Bears fans. I don't think St. Louisans sort of support anything in Chicago, and like we can get to that with Cardinals Cubs, but that's a weird thing. So there's not so many Bears fans, but a few Chiefs fans maybe, you kind of, if you grew up watching the NFL in St. Louis, you've got reasonable teams around you that are sort of Midwestern that you could probably drive to maybe. So, but then you get the Rams. So a lot of people who were big NFL fans probably already had teams. So there's that. And then you kind of go, okay, right, okay, we'll cheer for the Rams. So they sort of, you get given this team, and it's one of those things, I think, where if they're not your first team and they're sort of your second team, you'll go see them. But if they're not particularly good, you maybe wouldn't bother. And the problem with the way it works in the US is blackouts. And blackouts became a real problem in St. Louis, where they sort of said, if the Rams aren't selling out, we're not going to broadcast them. So it all kind of snowballs. It becomes a sort of cycle where the Rams aren't good, so nobody goes, so they don't broadcast them, so no one watches them, so no one's a fan, so nobody goes. And it becomes a sort of really awful cycle that doesn't really benefit sort of the city or the people in there, people in the organization. So yeah, the Rams are always third. St. Louis is a baseball town. The Cardinals will always be king. In the off season, we've got the St. Louis Blues, who had the record for making the playoffs the most times in professional sports and never winning it. So, but they did. So that's really exciting. But I think that the Blues are, let's go Blues. But I think the Blues are what Cardinals fans watch in the off season. And then you kind of got the Rams, and people were like, okay, cool. But the Rams were never going to be bigger than, they were never going to be the thing in St. Louis. But it is sad that they're moved, back to LA. I get it, they're from LA, but also there's so much going on. Does LA need the Rams? I don't know, maybe. But you don't want the city to lose anything. So obviously I love St. Louis, and I, want them to have everything. I want them to have that experience, but it's sort of an odd one with the Rams. I think people were sad that they left, but I don't think they were, really gutted, if that makes sense, because the Rams were a transplant to them from somewhere else.
Sure. And I'm assuming with you you have a slightly conflicting emotions with the Rams, given that you're a Tottenham Hotspur fan, and the Rams are owned by the Kroenke family, who also own Arsenal as well, who are Tottenham's rivals, for anyone who isn't au fait with the English Premier League.
Yeah, and if it was up to me, I would move their English team 1,800 miles west into the Atlantic Ocean if I could, and leave the Rams where they were.
So tell me then, what brought you back to the UK then? I know that you aren't living in Scotland now. You live close to me. You're in the Greater Manchester area, as I am. So what brought you back to the UK from St. Louis?
So I sort of finished university, and I kind of ended up working in retail and did sort of management-y stuff. And it just wasn't really what I wanted to do. My degree was in history, and I kind of thought about maybe being a history teacher, and I'd always kind of wanted to be a college professor or sort of a writer. And I went to university at Lindenwood, which is in the Greater St. Louis area. So I lived sort of nearby and kept in touch with my professors, and they sort of said, well, if you go get an advanced degree in history, you can come back here and we'll pay you to teach sort of intro, first and second year university students history. And then if you want, you can do a PhD or go to teaching or whatever. And I thought, oh, it's a great idea. So I applied so I thought, right, where am I going to go? And I thought, well, if I'm going to study history, it's going to be British history. So I want to be in London. And that happens to be sort of right near Tottenham. So that's kind of good. I could go watch Tottenham for a few years and, do that for a while. So I applied to King's and I applied to UCL. I didn't tell anybody that I did it because I didn't think I'd get in. I got into both and was like, oh, I'm going to have to do this now. So I did. I went to King's. I moved to London with the intention of being there for a year and then going back to St. Louis and teaching in St. Louis. And then I met my husband, my now husband, and didn't go back. Much to, I think my family loves Sean, but I think my mom's still slightly annoyed that I ended up moving back here. I met Sean in a bar after a Tottenham game, we went on 3 dates before he saw me not wearing a Tottenham shirt. And in his wedding speech, he said, "The key to my heart turned out to be a pie, a pint, and a programme." So yeah, so Tottenham, so our love, he's not a Tottenham fan, I must say. He would hate to be misled. He's not a Tottenham fan. He's a Norwich City supporter. So.
Norwich,
Norwich,
okay.
Norwich City.
Good team. Good team. Solid team.
Yeah. And, I must say, they may jump up and down leagues, but they've won more silverware in the last decade than Tottenham have. So, he get every now and then he gets annoyed about being relegated. But I'm like, but you've won a trophy. You get that's great. Fifth and fourth is not a trophy. But yeah, so then we stayed, and yeah, and now we live in Manchester. And we have two boys who I have to keep explaining will not be a United or City fan.
Sure. So okay. Who are they allowed to support then, given that you live in Greater Manchester and so they are nowhere near Tottenham or Norwich for that matter?
Well, we have sort of decided that the fair thing to do is let them support Stockport County. They are the closest club to us, so that's their local club, so that's who they should support. So, and they're on an upward trajectory. So hopefully by the time we can start taking them to games, they'll still be good. And I will say, I've written for their program and worked with people at the club, and it's really a nice club. It's, and it's really part of our community. And I think sometimes as a Premier League supporter, you're just a number. If I don't buy a ticket, there will be thousands of other people who will. Whereas at County, it sort of feels like it matters, and they still do sort of reasonably priced season tickets for kids, and that's it's nice to be. I appreciate that as a club, and I think that there's something sort of special about that you maybe don't get from support in a big club.
Yeah, and it should be said, Stockport County are definitely an ascendancy. They at the time that we're recording this, they've just been promoted from League Two, so they're going to be playing in League One next season. They are one of the headlines I noticed was there was a headline in the Daily Mail complaining about the fact that Stockport County had denied Wrexham the Hollywood ending of getting back-to-back promotions as the winners of the league. No mention of the fact that Wrexham did still get promoted to League One as well this season, and congratulations to them. Congratulations to Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. It has to be said they have, their ambitions for that club do seem to be bearing fruit. So, well done to them, and and more importantly, congratulations to the fans of Wrexham, given the position that they were in, not 3 years ago.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, we live very close to Edgeley Park, and when they got promoted, when Stockport got promoted out of the National League into League Two, my son was 1, and I thought, you need to be there. So I threw him in the stroller. It got to 80 minutes. They were up 2. I think they needed to win. They were up, I think, 2-0 at this point. I thought, right, they'll probably win. Threw him in the stroller, ran to Edgeley Park, and kind of pushed by this point, all the doors were open and stuff. It was bedlam. Got him into the bar, kind of lifted him up, and I was like, look at the trophy. Now you can tell people when you're 18 and that you were there at Edgeley Park when Stockport got promoted out of the National League. So that, I think it's important. It's been really cool to see that journey and kind of be on it to some degree. And in terms of Wrexham, they've had this Hollywood money. I'm going to try and say this and not sound bitter. They've had this Hollywood money, and they're doing great. And I'm sure that we will all enjoy them providing Stockport County a guard of honour next weekend.
Spoken like a true football fan, I have to say. So I have to ask then, like now that you're back in the UK, like how do you find the experience of supporting the Cardinals, the Blues, the Raiders from a different country now?
different. It's a lot of late nights, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yep.
We have MLB TV, so we try and I'm very lucky that I have a supportive husband who likes sport and who has gotten into baseball. The deal was I would like cricket if he liked baseball. So
Sure, that's a
we go
fair
to
trade, but we can talk about that more later.
yeah. So we have MLB TV and we try and just have it on all the time. I need my summer background. I know it's been hailing this week in Greater Manchester, but if the Cardinals are playing it summer somewhere, so we watch a lot of, and with us, it seems, I don't know if you find this, but early in the season you get a lot of 12 o'clock first pitches, which is great. It's when they start having sort of 7, 8 o'clock first pitches that you try and sort of not look at your phone and you maybe watch it, you put it on in the morning or the next day, and it's just about trying to get the time right, I think. And then with the NFL, again, you sort of hope you're just not the late game. And it's a bit hard,
yeah.
you know, supporting a team that's in Pacific time, not,
Yes.
you know, if you're on the East Coast, you've got sort of a better chance with the time difference, but on the West Coast, excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
it's
I
a
would
bit
agree.
trickier.
Like, it's been,
yeah, and it all evens out. You know, when I lived in St. Louis, when I watched a Tottenham game, I'd have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning on Saturday or Sunday. So it's sort of six and half a dozen. But you know, if you're here, it's the NFL or the baseball that keeps you up really late, and if you're in the US, it's the football that gets you up really early. And actually, there's a bar in St. Louis where the St. Louis Spurs go to watch football, and they open at like 6 a.m. And I used to go, and every now and then they'd have like the first time I went, they had the Dundee game on, and it was on before even the Tottenham game started. So he let me in early, and it was just me in an empty bar watching the Dundee game. It was great, surreal, but great at 6 a.m. on like a Sunday morning.
Yes, yeah, I would agree. Like, I'm a fan of Wigan Athletic, and one of the weirdest things I've ever experienced is being in Chicago on St. Patrick's Day and watching Wigan Athletic play West Bromwich Albion in a bar in Chicago, and on St. Patrick's Day, drinking green beer and, you know, watching a parade go by. It was certainly a very odd experience, but I think it speaks volumes about how popular the Premier League is becoming in America as well. You know, and you know, what was did you have any experience of that when you lived in St. Louis, of seeing that growth, or was that, or were you living in St. Louis before that, you know, the kind of the Premier League's explosion of the last decade, shall we say?
It was a little bit. So if you looked for it, you could find it. But you had to do a bit of looking, whereas I think now it's far more accessible, and I think it's broadcast on bigger sort of networks and things. And I just think that sport in general is far more accessible than it is, you know, than it is here. And we do have the 3 o'clock blackouts, and I understand that that's important, especially for lower league clubs, talking about sort of Wigan and Stockport. So I'm not going to say we should get rid of that or anything, but it is nice to be able to sort of watch anything. And it is slightly frustrating for me when I know that if I was in St. Louis, I could watch the Tottenham game, but I can't in this country. It's quite, you know, but it's definitely grown since. I remember really vividly the first time that it really, I think, was everywhere, that I noticed that people were talking about football, was when Gareth Bale left Tottenham. That whole summer that was something that was really, that I remember. It was something on ESPN. Like, they would stop what they were doing to talk about it. They stopped talking about the baseball to talk about it, which was quite new. Not so great, because it was about this great player leaving Tottenham. But that was sort of the first time where I really kind of went, oh, like, it's not just me and these few other people that like the Premier League. They think this is a big enough story that they're going to talk about it over American sport.
I suppose the question that I have to ask before we move on is, how does a lady from Dundee become a fan of Tottenham Hotspur?
Well, so my dad so you support the team your dad supports, of course. And we're from Dundee, so grew up a Dundee fan. And in the late 60s, early 70s, there's a player called Alan Goldine. He still has, I think he still has lots of Dundee's goal scoring records. And he got his big money move to Tottenham and became the king of White Hart Lane. And I think for my dad as a kid at the time, he was like, yep, okay, Dundee, Tottenham, and that Tottenham became his English team. And he likes to say you only need one scarf for Dundee, Tottenham, and Scotland.
Okay.
So
that's
how it began.
That certainly answers the question I had then, because it was I was rather puzzled as to how you could support both teams, but yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I mean, before we end, I think there's one issue I'd like to get your thoughts on. I think it's still a very important issue, and it unfortunately still does raise its ugly head every once in a while. We've seen a lot of strides in recent years of women in sports. We now have the Women's Super League being shown regularly on the BBC, but it's how do you find it? Like, do you feel more welcome as a supporter of these sports now, or is it still, do you still feel there's a little bit of an us and them?
So I think you're right. I think it's changed a lot. So I think back to when we lived in Dundee and I was little. I don't think it would have ever occurred to my dad in the late 80s, early 90s to take his little girl to Den or White Hart Lane. I don't think that would have ever occurred to him. And not because he would have wanted to not share this experience with me. I think it would have just been dangerous. You wouldn't take a little girl to a football match in the early 90s. You just wouldn't. And, and that's definitely different now. I see families with little girls, little boys at football matches, and that's great. I came to sport sort of later, and so my experience was that I wasn't really interested in sport when I was growing up. I never played sport. I didn't get into sport because I played it like a lot of kids. It wasn't really on my radar until I moved to St. Louis. And what is good about American culture is that there isn't the dark underside that I think exists a lot in football, unfortunately. Like I said, it's gotten better, but it's still, I think we can all agree, not perfect. It still exists. But it really doesn't in the States. And I remember going to NFL games even before we moved to the States. And we went to a Raiders game in San Diego at Qualcomm, which was fab. Gutted they moved. And my mum was really uneasy about being a Raiders fan and sitting amongst Chargers fans. She was like, this can't be right. What do you mean we're not in the Raiders section? And really quite on edge, because there was no, being the away fan sort of in with the home fans. And of course, Chargers fans didn't care. Nobody cared. And obviously, we're not obnoxious away fans. So it was fine. Everybody was perfectly nice to us, and we had a great day out. And it's like that, even if you go to Cardinals, Cubs, there's a bit oh, Cubs suck, but it's not aggressive in any way. It's not, full of swearing or, name calling. It's all quite, yeah, we don't like them and yeah, we want to beat them, but there's not any of that extra stuff. In terms of the going to football then, so again, I came to sort of sport later in life, and as a grown-up started going to football matches. And I'd go to football, when I moved to London, with friends who were women. We'd go just us. And that was fine. I have personally never experienced anything at a football match that made me feel unsafe or unwelcome. And I think that football clubs are doing a good job of trying their best to make it better. Even silly things like now, when you go to a football ground, there's always tampons in the women's bathroom. And it's one of the few places where that always happens. And it just feels like they're sort of trying, which is great. And now I know that is not the experience of every woman. And I know that it still happens in places. And that's really unfortunate, but I'm very lucky in that I've never experienced that, and I've been to quite a few grounds, sort of, as an away fan. I've been to, obviously, Tottenham more often than anywhere else, but it's not been something that I've personally faced. And I'm really grateful for that. And I think that football, what I love about football is that it brings people together. And I think football is, and all sport actually, all sport is at its best when it brings people together. And that's kind of, I think, what we need to focus on. And yeah, hate Arsenal, hate Dundee United. But, I think if we can focus on the things that bring us together, I think it makes it better for everybody, really.
Yeah, certainly. And I suppose, having had the experience of both countries, what do you think it is that means that an away fan can sit in amongst the home fans in the US, but it's not necessarily the best idea to do that in the UK? Like, why do you think there is that? What is the difference between those two cultures, and why do you think those differences exist?
Oh, that's a question. I think how much longer we got? I think I don't think it's ever really been a thing in America. I think that there's definitely underlying things that exist that football clubs have often kind of become a mask for, or a melting pot for, whether it's class differences, whether it's, sectarianisms, especially in Scotland. There are lots of these sort of political and religious things I think underpin football clubs in this country in a way that they definitely don't in the US. Like, a sports team is just a sports team. There's no sort of extra culture. Obviously, there are cultures around it. And, interestingly, I sort of think that, like, the Raiders are probably one of the closest teams that you get to that in terms of a political kind of underbelly with NWA. And, AP, the new Raiders coach, talks about being in Compton rocking a Raiders hat. And he's talking about a very specific place and time. And there's lots of connotations that exist around that the Raiders are a part of that culture, which I think the Raiders could do a lot more about talking about. And the Raiders have been involved. Al Davis didn't believe in segregation and wouldn't play anywhere where his black players could stay with his white players, because that to him was unacceptable. We had the first minority head coach. We had the first. I don't know if we had the first minority player. I don't want to say that in case I'm wrong. But these things sort of exist in America, in a lot of American sports. Like the Raiders are an example of sort of a franchise that has sort of other political things attached to it, but most don't. Whereas I think in this country there is a lot of underlying political and religious issues that create maybe more tension than just about the results. And I think possibly as the fan base widens, and as we have, there's lots of debates around sort of tourist fans, especially I think at like a lot of the bigger clubs, a lot of the London clubs. There's a lot of Korean fans who will come to Tottenham, for example, to watch Sonny, and they have no idea about any of this. And I think you have people now who I think that's maybe starting to fall away a little bit. In certain places it's not, and I think you kind of see that. Liverpool tend to be quite a political club, like it or hate it. I'm not wading in, but they will have sort of political messaging. Celtic definitely do. So I think that there are sort of these things underplaying football clubs that maybe we don't talk about or address, that then cause more animosity and feeling than there are in American sports. If you go to the Cardinals game, you're just there to watch a baseball team, and yeah, we want them to win, and we want them to especially beat the Cubs, and especially beat the Brewers, and especially beat the Reds. But that's really it.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, one thing came to mind when you were chatting there, and it's that I've certainly have noticed in recent years that there has been an uptick in the connection between politics and sports in the United States. We saw a lot of uproar, shall we say, when Colin Kaepernick took a knee for the national anthem, and then we've seen the response from the NBA in particular, following the murder of George Floyd, and the quite rightly the social movement that arose from that horrible incident. So but then we also get politicians saying, politicians of a certain ilk, shall we say, in America, saying, keep politics out of sport. So, where do you see that headed? Do you see politics and social issues embedding themselves more in sports, or do you think the keep politics out of sports movement will win? If win is the correct word, which I don't think it is.
No, and I don't think it's going to go away, because a lot of athletes are Black, and if they have a platform to make social change, then they should do that if they feel that they want to. And so I don't think that there will be, that this is going to just end, especially not when just certain politicians think that it should. If people feel that any community is faced with injustice and they want to speak out about it and use their platform, then more power to them. And I don't think it's going to stop, and I don't see sort of why it would. I think that more people are going to use their voices to make change in communities, for all kinds of communities, and especially the ones that they feel are mistreated. And yes, I don't think it's going to go away. I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think it will be interesting to watch it unfold. And I think you can see that more in leagues sort of the NBA than sort of baseball. And it's sad to me, you see some of the things that sports, the athletes get sent to them on social media, and the things that people say to them. But if you have a voice and you want to make a difference in your community, regardless of how important you are or what you do for a living, then you should make the world a better place.
No, I think that's a great note to end this chat on, Jennifer. So I will say thank you very much for joining me, and I hope all of our listeners and viewers have enjoyed this chat as much as I have. So thank you very much for joining me, Jennifer, and hope to speak to you again soon. So there you have it. I think we can all agree that was a much better chat, and I certainly hope that you were able to take in all of what Jennifer had to say there, and weren't distracted by the issues that beset the previous version of that chat. This being said, I'm now going to delete the original version of Jennifer's chat, so that this episode is the one and only version of Jennifer's chat, so that there is a much better representation of what she had to say online, and that is the only representation online that represents her and what she had to say far better than it has to be said, terrible version that I should not have put out last year, that did not do credit to her. Quite frankly, it did a disservice to Jennifer and the great things that she had to say, particularly those really important points towards the end that we and the wider world really do need to hear. On that note, this brings an end to another episode of the BCS podcast. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye bye now. The BCS podcast is written, produced, edited and hosted by me, Brett Walker. Thank you to Boris Anderoff and Pixabay for the use of the music and sound effects in this podcast. This week's guest was Jennifer Annerly.